This paper we're looking at really laid the groundwork for
Yeah.
so much of what we see happening today.
Yeah, can you imagine trying to explain this stuff back then?
Yeah.
People's minds must have been blown. So for our listeners, the ones who are up on all the amazing things diffusion models can do today, this deep dive is going to give you that aha moment like, wow, that's where it all began. So what was the big problem? These researchers, what were they even trying to solve?
Well, machine learning, it's always had this challenge, right? Finding that perfect balance between a model's simplicity and its ability to capture these really complex patterns. Simple models, super easy to work with, of course, but they might not be powerful enough, not enough to really represent that intricate data. And then on the other hand, you've got these complex models, super powerful, yes, but computationally expensive. This paper, it was all about bridging that gap.
So they wanted to have their cake and eat it too, huh? Complexity without the computational nightmare.
But where did they even find inspiration for this?
Okay, so get this. They actually drew inspiration from a seemingly unrelated field, non-equilibrium thermodynamics, physics.
Whoa, really?
Yeah. So picture a system. It's gradually heating up, so it's slowly moving away from a state of equilibrium. And that's kind of analogous to how they introduced noise into their data bit by bit to break down its
That's true.
structure.
They were messing things up on purpose. That sounds a little counterintuitive.
Right. It might seem that way. But there's a method to the madness, I promise. This process, they called it forward diffusion. It starts with a data set, let's say a bunch of images, and it systematically injects this Gaussian noise in stages. Like imagine you take a perfectly clear picture and you progressively blur it until it's just pure noise. You're basically stripping away the structure of the data,
Yeah.
but in a controlled way.
Okay, so it's like controlled chaos.
Yeah.
But how do you get the original data back from that noisy mess? That's where the magic happens,
Yeah.
right? Exactly. That's where reverse diffusion comes in. The real genius here is they trained a model to reverse that noise-adding process. It's like hitting rewind on the blurring, gradually denoising the data, step by step, until you recover that original picture, unblurring it.
It sounds almost too good to be true. What makes this approach so special?
Okay, so one of the most remarkable things about this is its flexibility and tractability. Each step in the diffusion chain, like each step of adding or removing noise, it can be calculated directly. This makes the whole process manageable, even with these really complex models with thousands of layers, which back in 2015, that was a really big deal.
Wow, so even with those huge models, they could keep track of everything. That's impressive. But how did they actually teach the model to do this whole reverse diffusion thing?
Yeah. They focused on what's called the model's log likelihood. Think of it as a measure of how well the model explains the data by finding the optimal parameters, essentially the best settings. For that reverse diffusion process, they could train the model to really effectively recover the original data, even from those noisy versions.
So the model learns to undo the mess it made, huh? Like cleaning up its own room. I like it. There's a certain elegance to that. But I'm guessing there's more to it than just, reconstruction.
Oh, absolutely. The paper also talked about how to calculate the probability the model assigns to the data. This is crucial for evaluating how well the model has learned the structure of the data. And they explored this concept of multiplying distributions. Really powerful tool for things like denoising or filling in those missing parts of an image.
Wait, multiplying distributions? That sounds a little abstract.
It might sound complex, but imagine you want to combine what the model knows about a clean image with the info you have from a noisy one, multiplying distributions. That lets you do just that. Like you're blending different sources of information.
Ah, okay, so you're weaving in new information into the model's understanding. Very cool. I could see how that would be useful for image restoration.
And there's even more. They also got into this concept of entropy. It's like a measure of uncertainty or randomness in a system. And they looked at how this entropy changes. During that whole reverse diffusion process, they even provided boundaries for this entropy, giving us insights into how efficient the process really is.
So they weren't just building a model, they were really dissecting its inner workings, huh? It's like they were trying to understand not just what the model was doing, but why.
Exactly. And this deep dive into the theoretical side of diffusion, it really set the stage for all those incredible advancements we've seen in the years since.
So a model is only as good as its performance. Did they put this model to the test? In the real world, I mean. What kind of data did they use?
Oh, they did. And they didn't just stick to one type. They tested it on a whole variety of data sets, ranging from simple 2D shapes to these really complex natural images like bark and leaves. Even the MNIST data set, with handwritten digits.
Wow, that's quite the range. I'm guessing it did pretty well then, given how influential this paper has become.
Yeah, the results were pretty impressive, actually. They showed this approach could handle all these different types of data and capture a wide range of patterns. Like, it could generate realistic images of handwritten digits, even complex textures like bark.
This all sounds incredibly advanced, especially for 2015. It's like they were peering into the future of AI.
It really highlights the power of interdisciplinary research. I mean, who would have thought that physics could inspire this huge revolution in AI? It's a good reminder. Sometimes those groundbreaking ideas, they come from looking outside of our own fields.
That's a great point. You know, what's fascinating to me is how this early work, it laid the groundwork. For the diffusion models we see today, the ones that can generate those incredibly realistic images, it's like they planted the seeds for a whole new era of AI.
And those seeds have definitely blossomed. But we're just getting started on our journey back in time. Coming up next, we'll dive into the specifics of how Sohl-Dickstein and his team actually implemented this diffusion model and the clever tricks they used to make it all work. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Let's unpack some of those specifics, how Sohl-Dickstein and his team actually brought this model to life.
All right, let's get down to brass tacks. You mentioned earlier each step in this diffusion chain. It had to be analytically evaluable. Now, for our listeners who might not be familiar with that term, can you break that down for us, make it easy to understand?
Oh, absolutely. Basically, it means that for every single step of either adding or removing noise, the math, it just works out perfectly. You can calculate exactly how that image is going to change with each blur or unblur step. Makes the whole process way more manageable, especially when you're dealing with those massive, complex models.
So they were looking for elegant math.
Yeah.
Math that could keep up with the complexity of the models. Makes sense. Now, I remember you talked about two types of diffusion, Gaussian and binomial. Gaussian diffusion, that's all about adding that classic bell curve noise, right?
Exactly. It's like each pixel in your image, it gets nudged a little bit, some up, some down, all based on that bell curve distribution. And over many steps, that adds up to that blurring effect we talked about.
Okay, so Gaussian diffusion, that's for continuous data, like the pixel values in an image. What about binomial diffusion? What kind of data does that work with?
Binomial diffusion, that's best suited for discrete data. Imagine each pixel, right? It can only be black or white. Binomial diffusion is like flipping a coin to decide if each pixel should flip its color at each step. It's another way to introduce that gradual, controlled noise.
Okay, so two flavors of diffusion. Gaussian for continuous, binomial for discrete. So what do they actually do with these?
They used them to build those forward and reverse trajectories we discussed. Remember, forward diffusion, it corrupts the data step by step with noise.
Wow.
And then reverse diffusion tries to clean it up, recover the original.
Right, like blurring and unblurring a picture. How did they actually define that reverse process? Did they have to specify each step of denoising? That sounds like a nightmare.
Thankfully, no. They were much smarter than that. They realized that under certain conditions, the reverse of a diffusion process, it can actually mirror the forward process, just with different parameters. Parameters the model needs to learn.
Wait, so they kind of got a 2-for-1 deal? The math just worked out that way?
In a way, yeah. Like if you use Gaussian diffusion going forward, the reverse process, it'll, under the right conditions, also use Gaussians, just with different means and variances. And the model, it has to figure those out.
That's a huge time saver.
Yeah.
So the model doesn't need to learn a whole separate process for denoising.
Yeah.
It just have to, tweak some parameters. What kind of models did they even use to learn these parameters?
For all their experiments, they went with these multi-layer perceptrons, a type of neural network. But they emphasized you could use other regression techniques too. The key is you need a model that can learn to predict the right parameters for each step of that reverse diffusion.
Makes sense. So they have flexibility there. What about the number of steps in the diffusion process? How did they decide how many steps to use for all that blurring and unblurring?
Good question. For their Gaussian diffusion experiments, they actually let the model learn the optimal diffusion schedule, so the amount of noise added at each step. That was a parameter the model learned.
Oh, wow. So they gave the model control over how much chaos to introduce at each stage. That's pretty neat. It's like giving the model a knob to control that blurring. What about binomial diffusion? Did they do the same thing?
For binomial diffusion, they went with a fixed schedule. They erased a constant fraction of the original data with each step.
So a more deterministic approach for binomial diffusion. Sounds like they were really paying attention to the specifics of each diffusion type.
Yeah.
And tailoring their approach.
Exactly. Really shows their deep understanding, both the theory and the practice of diffusion models. And speaking of practice, they didn't just start at generating data. They showed how their model could handle real-world problems too, like image denoising and in-painting.
We haven't touched on those applications yet. I'm really curious to hear how they adapted the model for those tasks.
Let's dive into that next. That's where the real power of this approach starts to shine.
Okay, let's talk real-world applications then. You mentioned denoising and in-painting. Remind me what those are again, and how they use this diffusion model to actually, do them.
Sure. So image denoising, that's all about removing noise from a corrupted image. Like imagine you have this grainy, blurry picture. Denoising cleans it up. In painting, that's more about filling in missing parts of an image, like think digitally restoring a torn photograph.
Okay, got it. So
That's
how
right.
they use this diffusion model for those, it seems like a pretty big jump from just generating data from scratch.
It is. And this is where that multiplying distributions thing comes in. Remember we talked about how they could multiply the learned distribution with another one? Well, that's super useful for things like denoising and in-painting.
Okay, yeah. I'm starting to see the connection. So instead of just generating data, blindly, they could actually guide the model using some extra information.
Exactly. Perfect example. Let's say you've got a noisy image. You can actually encode that noisy image as a probability distribution. And then you multiply that. Multiply it with the distribution the model has learned, which, remember, represents its knowledge of clean images.
Ah, okay. So you're combining what the model already knows about clean images with the specific info from that noisy image. It's like giving the model a hint.
Exactly. And this multiplication, it creates a new distribution. It basically represents the most likely clean image given that noisy input. It's called the posterior distribution.
Okay. And then you can just sample from that posterior to get your denoised image.
That's it. And for in-painting, it's a really similar process. You take the parts of the image you do have, encode them as a distribution, multiply that with the model's learned distribution, sample from the posterior, and boom. The model fills in those missing parts based on what it knows about what the overall image should look like.
Wow, that's really clever. Like giving the model a puzzle. Some pieces are missing, and it just figures out how to complete it. Did they have any examples of this in the paper?
Oh yeah, they did. They showed in-painting on this image of bark texture. They removed a big chunk of it, and the model, it filled in those missing parts, totally realistically, blended them seamlessly with the existing texture.
So it's not just theoretical. They actually showed it works. And remember, this was 2015, way before those super powerful diffusion models we have now.
Yeah, it's crazy to see how far diffusion models have come since this paper came out. But looking back, it's so clear that Sohl-Dickstein and his team, they were already laying the foundation for so many of the techniques we use today. They introduced those key concepts, forward and reverse diffusion, that connection to non-equilibrium thermodynamics, that genius use of multiplying distributions, for stuff like denoising and in-painting.
And they showed this approach could handle all sorts of data, from simple shapes to those really complex images. It's a great reminder. Sometimes the best innovations, they come from connecting those seemingly unrelated ideas from different fields. Who would have thought physics could inspire a revolution in AI?
Right. This paper was huge. It was a pivotal step in the whole development of diffusion models, gave us both the theoretical groundwork and the practical demos to really inspire a generation of researchers.
Next time you see one of those amazing AI images,
Mm-hmm.
the ones that are everywhere these days, just remember, it all started with a group of researchers who dared to connect physics and AI. They planted those seeds for a revolution in generative modeling. And those seeds, man, they've blossomed into some incredible tech.
It's a real testament to curiosity,
Yeah.
interdisciplinary thinking, that willingness to just explore the unknown.
And who knows what other groundbreaking connections are out there waiting to be discovered.
Exactly.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the history of diffusion models. Until next time.